Okay, hello everyone. We are continuing the Wolfram Language Design Review associated with formatting for Tabular. We had started this a couple of days ago. We are now continuing. All right. So, where had we got to previously?
So we had gotten to trying to resolve the situation of how to specify styles or
Right.
attributes.
So it was inside out versus outside in, and this whole question of whether we have some kind of wrapper that indicates some metadata wrapper that indicates that something is styled in a particular way. And we talked about item as a way to do that. And where did we leave that?
I think we had moved away from that for a little bit, and we were discussing how to deal with things that are sort of sticky to the content or always row two, or if you start
Okay,
at row
all right.
two, but then
So
it moves around.
so look, I think we got these different cases. Do I have notes in here
I
from what we were
think your
looking at?
notes are mainly at the top there. Those
Um,
those those, those
yes,
top
Okay,
three cells were what you added.
right.
hmm
Positional formatting, function application that's data dependent, and writing with the elements. Right?
Yes.
Those are the three cases. Okay, so positional formatting, we think we have some understanding of how to specify that, right? So in other
Right.
words,
So that's
basically,
using cyclic and things like this and
well, but let's understand what it is. Are we doing something where, I mean, there are two approaches we could take. One is an approach where we say where, and then we say arrow, and then we have a bunch of styles here, which says background arrow, whatever, whatever,
hmm
whatever. Another approach we could have is to say background arrow, and then where arrow color type thing. See what I'm saying? So in other words, this would be something where we would be saying where, and then we would saying, whoops, we'd be saying where arrow, and then where we'd have a list of wheres. Okay, so here we've got where one, etc., and here we would be saying background arrow, whatever it is. Okay, where two, blah blah blah. That's one approach. Another approach is this approach here, where we're saying where one is color one, etc., where two is whatever. Making sense?
What's
and where in that case is
Well,
where is
positional formatting. So that
r-
means
right, but how does it relate to get everybody on the same page with row versus column versus individual cell, individual item?
okay. So we obviously need some way to reference things in here. So for columns, I mean, you have mentioned the idea of a row key. No, we have a row key.
We have a row key.
So row key of four means potentially row four, and then a naked column means a column. And something, so how do we reference normally? How do we reference a single element here normally? Do you
A
understand my
single
question?
element would be a row and a column pair.
No, I understand, but how do I extract a single element of this? I go row, comma, clarity.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's
So
VS2.
what does
Yes.
extract do with this?
I would assume the same thing.
Okay. All right. So,
and part does the same thing?
Yes.
But it's var arg.
Yeah.
okay. All right. Okay. So, so each of these things, like the extract, for example. So now if I say replace part, do we go through this before? Does this work?
I think we determined that replace part didn't work.
Okay, but it probably should, right? It's just going to build another.
Yeah,
it didn't
basically
work.
has to build a whole new.
That's
Right.
fine. It's building a
Yeah.
whole new tabular. It's all good. You know, hopefully it can link to the column keys and things, right? Hopefully it's only building a new tabular in the sense that it's changing that one column. Am I making sense?
Right. Right. Well, the more complicated place is a replace part where the part refers to several elements.
Sure. Sure. But I think we should make it work. Agreed?
Yeah, I can try to do that.
Excellent. Okay. So now we've got positional formatting. We need to know how do we refer to elements here. So what's a little odd, how do we normally refer to a whole column? Do we have a place where we have to give a wrapper to refer to a column?
I mean, within tabular,
Yeah.
I
I mean, if
mean,
I say
usually,
diamond,
if you're referring to a whole column, you're
it's
referring
all
to
comma
the name
this.
of that column.
Or key. You can always use key.
Yeah, okay,
All
but I
comma
mean,
clarity. Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah.
And the typesetting on tabular column is weird right now.
Okay, all right,
There's a
fine.
fix for that in review.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so, all right.
Right. And in terms of like, the two things that you've put there, what we've used in the past is something where you have background goes to a spec, and the spec is super complicated because it's rows and columns and individual items and
I know.
and then what we had proposed a couple days ago was going the other way where we have lots of options that give you targeted specifications. And I think you were
Like
concerned
row
that that leads
background
to
and
sort of
column
too many
background and so on.
options.
Yeah, because I don't know how we do, framing an individual element and blah, 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 blah.
Right.
But I think that there's sort of three things. There's a background, foreground, decorator, right?
Well, so let's list them. Okay, so we've got sort of annotations.
I mean, if you scroll down a little bit.
I know.
Yeah. Okay.
We've got styling of content. Okay, make it bold, for example.
Mhm.
Yeah.
We've got background of item, right?
Yep.
We've got framing of item, and we've got decorating of content.
Yes.
Yes.
And
And
then
we
you also
might
have
have-
things like alignment.
Okay, hold on. We might also have decorating of item. So it's like put a highlight around that particular cell. Am I making sense? Framing might not be the only, you might want to have a wavy line or some weird funky thing around bordering the cell or something, decorating the item somehow. In other words, decorating the content. I'm not even sure what that, I mean, so yeah, all right. So then, and now there's another subpart of this, which is headers versus body, right?
Yep.
Whether you're decorating a header or whether you're decorating the body.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So I just want to understand here with positional formatting, the canonical way to enter a position is row column. And each of those could be wild carded, it could be all, it could be whatever else. Am I making sense?
Yep.
So, and a specification, in a perfect world, right? What we have is as if everything, let's say it's item VS1, would be that item. That's what this is as if it is, if you understand what I'm saying. Now, we could have it so that if you put item, when you create a tabular, if you have a thing that says item, if one of these entries says item, that the item could somehow melt away. So in other words, what we would do is we would say item, let's say you're creating a tabular and you want this to have a green background. Okay. Then we'd say item, BS1, background green. When we create the tabular, the item would melt away, just like units would melt away, and this would be stored in some overarching, formatting wrapper outside. Am I making sense?
Outside of what?
In the overall options to the tabular.
Okay, so gotcha. I thought you meant like outside of the tabular entirely, or and just wanted to make sure. Yeah, but it gets stored in the option. It gets converted to an option form or something.
Yes.
Which is what graph does, for instance.
Yes.
Does graph allow item?
No.
Well, no, I mean, if you do
But you
graph
can use
and you
wrappers
can put
around
style
vertices
around
and
a
Style.
edges.
vertex.
Okay, so then we could do the same thing here. We could have a style wrapper. We could have all kinds of things here. But the item wrapper will allow us to reference the outer boundary of that cell. Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, I mean, I
Right.
think everything we're doing is generally happening at the item level. I mean, we don't generally have things that, like the
No, but we
options we've
might
been
want this. Look,
prototyping.
yeah, okay, fine. But let's say there's nothing wrong with saying this, for example. And we'd like it to be possible to do that as a wrapper that doesn't affect the content of the tabular. Or a call out or I'm sorry, or a mouse over, all those kinds of things. Tooltip, those sorts of things. Why not? Have tooltips be able to be added, and again, we're going to discuss whether they ride with the data or how they work. See what I'm saying?
Yep.
But being able to put that in there and then having it be sort of puffed out to the outer options of the tabular seems like the right thing. Make sense?
I think that this is only useful for kind of smallish.
Right. I mean,
tabulars.
that's what I was thinking
No,
as
no,
well. That your
just
typical tabular,
hold on a
98% of the
second.
time.
Just hold on a second.
Yes.
I'm trying to get a specification that can work at all scales.
Yeah.
Okay? This
No, that's
particular
fine. It's
thing,
fine, Stephen. But
you're not going to put item for 100,000 items. No, you're not going to do that. You're going to do it as an outer option. See what I'm saying?
Yes.
But what we need to do is we need to understand what this looks like, because then when let's now say, once we've done this at the level of individual items, then the puffed out option will probably look like a list of row, column, arrow, and then I don't know exactly what the content is, right? So, I mean, it could be as much as, something like item styles or something, item options, arrow, background light green, blah, 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 blah. You know, I don't know exactly what this looks like. Or it could be that row column, we have to distinguish between an item, see what I'm saying? An item option and a style option. Do you see what I'm saying? Those do different things, right? This goes to this fills the whole cell with light green. This puts light green behind VS1. See what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying.
Because we want to be able to do this. We want to be able to put styles in there without affecting the computational aspects of the tabular. Okay, let's at least see whether we can make that work. Okay. So here, and we're okay. I mean, let me just say that I think that things like row backgrounds, arrow, depth, arrow, light green or something is perfectly possible. But I think it might be better because this is now, how would we do that? Let's say we want to add 1 to every element of depth. How do we do that with transform? What we would do is transform columns, right? Am I correct? Tabular, depth arrow, and then we would say hash depth +1. Is that correct?
Yes, with function.
Like that.
Yep.
Okay. So in a sense, what we're doing is what we're saying. I mean, let's just write this down. I don't think this is the right thing to do, but let's say we say annotate columns of tab. Oh my gosh. No, this isn't the right way to do it. But that's sort of adding an annotation track. Am I making sense?
It depends on what the XXX is, but
Well, I mean, it's
Yeah,
something that says background arrow, whatever.
right.
Okay, so this might say something like, background arrow light green.
But
I don't.
presumably that could be a computed thing if you have that syntax at this point.
I would assume so, yes. Yes, okay, fair point. So maybe it isn't this. Maybe this is item of hash depth background arrow light green. Okay, so it could perfectly well say if depth is greater than 0, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
This seems like not a completely stupid construct.
By the way, this is a good reason why item shouldn't be considered to just melt into the parent options.
In what sense? I mean, on the construction of a tabular, I think it can. But by melt, I don't mean, whatever.
Because item can be applied as a decorator or in this case an annotation or something that is different from the actual tabular data itself.
Okay. Well,
it's kind of a dynamic construct, and it doesn't make any sense to freeze that dynamic construct into the options of the parent tabular.
I'm not going to comment on that yet. I'm not sure I fully understand. But let's just keep going for a moment here.
Well, I'll just mention there's another possible view of this thing you wrote, the annotate columns is in effect what you're making is an auxiliary tabular
Exactly.
that has the styles in it. And basically that for relatively few items that can be stored efficiently, because anything where you haven't specified a style in that auxiliary tabular, it's missing, and our missing data is held very efficiently.
Okay, that's good to know. Right. So I mean, then this could potentially be, there could be a thing called tabular annotations or something that is either an option that has a big long thing that is maybe the secondary tabular or annotation tabular or something. Arrow, and then it's a tabular. Now, I do like the idea of having this superimposed tabular, because then with all the same addressing as the previous one. But it's okay, then so let's if we take that point of view, okay? Okay. Let's look through these different approaches. Okay. So one is you do it once, you have the tabular sitting there. Another, function application formatting.
But it's kind of what you did, isn't it? In a way.
No, I know that. But the question is, when does this happen? See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Let's say you've done a transform columns that changes the value of depth. and then you have a new, well, okay, so the question is, you've created a new tabular, right? Does the annotation tabular get rerun? Does the definition of the annotation tabular get rerun when you create the new tabular? So it's kind of an immediate versus delayed annotation.
Mhm.
I mean, I think it depends on how you got there, sort of. So if you got there via some sort of, via annotate columns with depth goes to some function, and then you do a transform columns.
I think look, unless it's a delayed annotation, I don't think it happens in the, I think it's done. Whatever you got, whatever annotation, we're going to talk for a minute about writing with the elements. In a moment, we're going to talk about writing with the elements. We haven't talked about that yet.
Right.
But one possibility here is that it's as simple as this, that does the delayed annotation.
So another way to consider annotations is that instead of annotations creating an entirely second tabular, that annotations represent display functions.
Yes. Where do they get stored? John, we're not suggesting this creates another tabular. We're suggesting there is another tabular which is used as the displayer of the first tabular. It's the displaying overlay of the first tabular.
That's what I'm talking about, perhaps imprecisely.
Okay.
I mean, the question is the kernel creating another tabular with transformed data, or
No.
in which case, there's, you have to figure out kind of how much you're going to do up front, or do these represent transformations that only happen when the front end actually has to display the data? So that's what I'm calling the display function case.
Yeah, I understand.
So the underlying tabular is static. It never gets changed. What gets changed is the set of transformation functions which are used when the kernel sends each element up to the front end to be displayed.
Yeah, okay. So what I had in mind here was but we need to talk about writing with the elements in a minute. Okay. We need to talk about other things. I mean, remind me how annotation works for a graph. How do I annotate an element? Let's say I have a graph. Okay, so let's say I have a random graph like this, and I want to annotate element. I want to put.
So you can do two things. You can set the options. You could do sort of graph, comma, that graph, and then sort of set
I know that.
option.
Right.
But we built a much simpler interface which abstract a bunch of things called highlight graph.
Yeah, I know that too. But how do I do it with annotations? How do I set an annotation for one of these vertices?
Well, I think you could do two ways to set annotations, and
there's no set annotations.
There are two ways. There's one that copies and there's one that doesn't. Okay. There's one, the one that copies is obviously less efficient, but sufficient in most.
What is it? What is it?
Fuck, we changed all those property names.
We did?
Yeah. It was called properties, but
well, how do we attach it to that thing? I mean, do we just say graph of annotation rules?
Maybe it's annotate. I can't remember now.
I mean,
it
you
used
can
to be
definitely
set
say
properties.
graph of annotation.
Okay.
Whatever set properties was and became.
Okay, so wait a minute. So this is annotate of the graph, and then the key.
So vertices are just the names of the.
Right, it's this horrible thing. So we're doing that, and then we're saying where in the graph we're annotating, like that. right? So the analogous thing in Tabular would be tab, comma, row, comma, column. So we say vertex style arrow red. Okay, fine. What the hell's that? What is that? I mean, that might be, what is that? That may be a feature of the prototype build. Somebody
It
needs to
very
check
well
that.
could be. It looks very similar to a message I was seeing elsewhere.
Okay, right, fine. So that needs to be checked, right? Got it. Yes, no. Do I need to do something on this? Somebody
No, I
else?
don't think so.
Okay.
But the
Okay.
where in graph is like the name of the vertex or the actual edge. See what
Yep,
I'm
I
saying?
understand. So I mean,
Okay.
for example, here I could say if the edge exists, you know, one, and then this is arrow 2 or something.
Right. Well, then you need to say probably edge style or something.
Okay, fine. Okay, so that's a form of annotation there, which stores itself with annotation.
Yeah, if you look at the full form of that thing, you'll see it.
Right.
The
So if
input
I say
form.
options of that,
Right.
I see. So they melted there. The annotation rules melted into edge styles.
Yeah, the full form, you know, that you can always see that they're outside. You know,
Yeah,
because
I understand.
the core topology is a sparse array or two sparse arrays in general.
Right. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. So let's go back up here. So we've got some kind of model for sort of separate layer annotation in graph, right?
Mhm.
Now graph doesn't have the feature. I mean, this business about the thing could change from, I mean, in graph, the calculus of annotations. Okay, remind me what we ended up doing with this. So if I take this graph, which is red there, and I make a subgraph, right?
Yeah,
And I
it will
say
preserve
subgraph.
that.
Okay, so subgraph of that, let's say range of 4.
Mhm.
Okay. All right. So
So I'm a little bit surprised that the embedding didn't get preserved.
I'm not. I'm not. I've done this a million times with subgraphs. It doesn't preserve the embedding,
Okay.
which is just as well. I'm happy that it doesn't preserve the embedding.
Mhm.
Although there is a certain argument in this case, but this is a different design issue, that we should have an option for all these functions like subgraph.
I think you can
what to
do
preserve.
vertex embed inherited or something like that.
I'm surprised. But let me just suggest as a separate design item, might be an LCC item, the concept of a general option that talks about the, you know, what you are going to inherit in something like a subgraph computation. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So somebody made a note of that. Hello.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, you got to say yes, because otherwise I don't know that you got it. Otherwise it just
Yeah, I'm
goes into the
always
ether.
taking
Okay,
notes of that.
so please, yeah. So because each one of these things, it's like, do you understand? And do we take notes? Okay, let's go back up here. Okay, so in general, we might have a notion of annotate of the tabular with a designator of what we're annotating. Like it could be something like this, and then we might have a convenience annotate columns and so on to do the obvious thing there. But annotate in general would take a collection of, well, I don't know exactly what. I mean, these are functions, which is a little different than we're doing here. Where here, yeah, it's a different use of annotate. It works slightly differently, which is annoying. Unless we literally did this. But it's kind of annoying. I mean, we'd end up with a bunch of fold lists of annotates, if you get what I'm saying. Right?
Yeah, that would be annoying.
Right. But so okay. There might be a way to do that here. I don't know if I say here, oh yeah, that works fine. Okay, so we can imagine something like that, where we're saying annotate this at this location, the tabular, the location, and then the options. Am I making sense?
Mm-hmm.
Now, those are raw options. They're not transforming. So I don't quite understand the relationship between those. And there's the notion of immediate annotation and delayed annotation. Does that make sense to people?
Yes, and I think if we do have this annotation tabular, we want those delayed things to stay as functions, because
We do.
then if
Yeah,
you
we
change
do.
the data, it will automatically do it correctly.
Yeah, we do. So that has to be a way, arguably, what gets stored in the elements of the annotation tabular. I don't know whether I don't know how user visible the whole thing will be, but it could just be either a list of options or a function. I don't know. Even the list of options isn't going to be enough because you have to say it's in an item and things like this. So I have a feeling it's going to end up being an association that gets stored in the elements of the annotation tabular. Does that make sense? So it becomes item options, content options. I don't know what item function, let's say. I'm not sure exactly, but something like that. Does that make sense?
And so the item versus content would be basically whether
Style
that
versus
function
item.
returned item or style.
Yep. Yep. Now, I don't know in the case of tooltip, I don't know whether we have a notion, this is a question for John, a notion of a tooltip whose hit box is the whole item, as
No.
opposed to what's that?
No.
But we might want that.
Plausible.
Okay.
Depends on the tooltip, but plausible.
Okay. All right. So that's an issue here. Okay. All right. Let's go back here to writing with the data, writing with the elements. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Because all of this stuff, an annotate. Okay. So we don't really have, I mean, in a graph, for example, we have a name of a vertex, right? So we know how to ride with those vertices.
Yes.
In the case of a tabular, if we do an annotate, how the heck do we make the annotation tabular? Because what we've got to do is transform. Well, I guess we do this. The question is, does the annotation tabular get transformed in the same way that the base tabular gets transformed? Like if we sort a row, if we sort something, we could simply apply the same operation to the annotation tabular if we knew to do it. See what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
How?
I mean, and I'm trying to think if there's any cases where you've called annotator, the annotate function, and not want it to ride with the data.
Oh, I think there are plenty of places. I mean, there are plenty of cases. Let's say that what you want to do is make it alternating, green and white rows, for example. and then you sort the rows. You absolutely do not want that. That's just a display convenience. Okay. Similarly, I
But
can
is that an
absolutely
annotation? Or is that something else? I would say that an annotation is a heavier thing than just I'm alternating styles
well, but I
between
think
two
yeah, but
things.
we want a way to just say apply this thing to the tabular format wise. And I don't see why. Okay, so I mean the question of whether this is more again a, like the immediate and delayed annotation, this is a data, you know, this is a data attached annotation as opposed to a scaffolding annotation.
Right.
I mean, one has to be careful that let's say that you add two columns together.
Yep. Same thing as with the calculus of annotations for graphs. If you add two columns, what happens to the colors?
Well, I mean,
Right.
it probably depends on the details of how you added them together. If you add two columns together and stick it in a completely new third column.
No, then the color just doesn't go there.
Right. If you
It's a question of
add
if
two
you're using
columns
transform
together
columns.
and it goes back into one of the columns, then
Look, I think
whatever
it's
you
well
specified
defined.
for that column gets redone.
Guys, I think it's pretty well defined because I think transform columns is always talking about existing columns, right? So whatever it was that you defined for those columns is going to get applied. If you create a new column, as Brett says, it's new territory. Nothing's been defined. Except maybe things which are global to the whole tabula. Okay, so let's go over this again. I mean, so we've got the scaffolding annotations and the data attached annotations. Because I think it's going to be the exact same types of annotations. I mean, to say, I always want the first two, let me give you an example, okay? I want the top 5 elements to be highlighted, okay? I'm going to sort them different ways. But I always want, it's the top 5 players sorted by this, that, and the other. I want to show them highlighted.
Yep.
Which is a scaffolding attached annotation.
Can I just say I really like the idea of scaffolding as a term here.
Okay. I wasn't totally convinced, but yeah, at least we can tell what we mean, which is
a lot of the problem is like, position has double meanings and it's,
right. Okay. So now, okay, so let's look at what we would be doing here. So let's say we've got our annotation tabula, which is a parallel tabula, which in principle you could mess with and feed in. But, if you do that, it's up to you to get it right, and it'll just get completely confused if it doesn't agree. And presumably we have the schema for the tabula. We can easily determine if you change the schemas don't agree, you're out of luck. Rob, does that make sense to you?
Yes, I think that makes sense.
I mean, certain aspects of the schemas, the data types are going to be different, but
if the names don't match, then
the column names might change, the data types might match. So, I mean, there are mappings where we can do that, but figuring out which works and which doesn't is going to be difficult at best.
Okay, but let's just zoom out. I mean, I think the least crazy way to do this whole thing is with annotation tabulas, rather than trying to, because otherwise I don't know where we put all this stuff. What do other people think? And that way it's pretty clean in terms of, there is a tabular where if you do normal on it, you lose all the annotations. It is what it is. If you really want, we might have some WFR somewhere that can pick up the annotations and start spraying them into the normal thing and so on. Does that make sense? But otherwise, annotation tabular when you do normal, it just gets blown away. Yes?
I think so.
That's right. I mean, you shouldn't, when you do normal, you don't, I mean, if you do normal of graph, do you necessarily get all the annotations?
No, you don't. You don't get any of them.
Right. So.
Actually, normal isn't a thing with graph. You can do edge list, for example.
Right. Okay. So.
Okay.
But yeah, I think the normal should represent the data, as
I think
opposed to, yeah.
Okay. All right. So now, I mean, we haven't talked about things like headers and so on, but I suspect that those become special locations in some, well, in a row number. What happens? Wait a minute. There's also when do the row names get?
When you have key columns.
Okay.
You mean existing, currently,
Yeah, right.
Yes. So if you have key columns, then you have unique row names that you can access via row key.
Okay. So now there are also things that we already defined for data set that are, global appearance options, like how do you highlight a row key and things? Sorry, how do you highlight a key column? Now, let me just remind myself, for data set, how does all this work? What kind of display options are there? Can you describe that? I mean, clearly these options we have to be gradually moving over. Is Jose
Right.
here?
Jose is here.
Yes, I'm here. Yes, so the dataset has these options. Some of them are inherited from grid, some of them are new, and it follows basically the grid notation with some extensions and some
on steroids.
Yes.
What they're extensions because it's multidimensional things.
Yes, and it accepts keys and things like that.
Okay, but this has the form background arrow, some very complicated set of specifications, correct?
Yes.
Right.
So it has the set of the header options, and then the super function here is item display function and header display function. Those allow you to take control.
That's an alternative approach.
I mean, it's the ultimate option, but you're in it.
Hold on.
It's heavy, yeah. So this is when you want to have full control on everything. It will be probably slower, but you have full control. It takes a function of 4 arguments, I think, 3 or 4.
I think 3 is documented.
3 documented, yeah. And
item position.
And the whole data set, just in case you want to look at netboarding, the columns, whatever.
Okay. I mean, that is a good fallback for Tabular to have an item display function.
And it does. But, it's a fallback where you're programming. Right. It's, if this equals this and that equals this, go do, yeah.
Okay.
So.
Okay. All right. Let's just look down at your other things. And I mean, I think we've got a good, this is a good start here. Do people agree? Or, I mean, so in other words, we might have some convenience functions, but this would be the main. Okay, we've got different levels. Okay, so levels. You know, full complexity is item display function, with which you can do everything, correct?
Well, between that and the header display function, yes.
Yeah. Okay, then we've got the other end of at the other extreme, we've got sort of bulk options for the whole tabular. And examples there are things like background, or is there a thing for saying how many rows you want to display? That's a thing we have in dataset, right? How many rows to display by default? What's that called?
Max items.
Okay, do we have that for tabular or not yet?
We have, so Tabular is using the table view option, I believe, which is allowed dimensions.
Yeah, but there's no need for max items. I mean, it's basically just image size.
Right. Image size is the most important one, I think.
Okay, all right. All right, so okay, fine. But there are bulk options. Okay, so now we're dealing with the intermediate levels. Okay. And the intermediate level is, annotations, I claim. Okay, by row, item, etc. Arguably, this case where you're applying a function could be simply an item display function in the annotation. See what I'm saying?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm only pausing because I was 30 minutes ahead of you on that.
Oh, okay.
This was kind of what I was trying to say a half an hour ago when you said to table that discussion.
Okay, all right, fine. All right, good. Okay, I finally got there. Okay. So, okay. So then what's happening is everything is immediate. If you do annotate columns, it immediately creates the annotation tabular. And the only thing we haven't defined there is it scaffolding related or data attached?
Well,
Right.
well, when it's data dependent, it better be data attached. I mean, if you want to highlight the negative profit numbers or something like that, it better
Yeah.
be there and not what a slot is.
Sure. All right. But now, how do we do? So you're saying the more common case is data attached. Is that correct?
I think both. I think you want sort of beautiful, alternating rows kind of things. But the more interesting one that we have now is decorators and data dependent because they
Okay.
they provide insight. And
Yeah,
that's
okay,
something you
I
want to
got it. I got it. But
communicate.
how do we specify in an annotation? How do we specify whether we want it for the scaffolding or for the data? In other words,
I mean, I think
yeah.
probably it's either a wrapper of some sort or there's
I
two
got another idea.
syntaxes.
I've got another idea. Look, basically, okay, I'm going to write this out in a horrible way, but there'll be annotations tabular, and there would also be scaffolding No, scaffold doesn't have an H. In other words, because what's got to happen is the scaffolding annotation tabular has to not get transformed.
Yes.
When you transform the original one, right? Just sits there. And if its structure doesn't agree with the final structure, like if you've removed half the columns or something, and the scaffolding is still saying, hey, I want that one pink, we've just got to have a strategy where we're ignoring, ignore the columns that aren't there.
Right. I mean, it's not clear to me that the scaffolding one, needs the internal second tabular.
Why not have it? I mean, if Rob says it's sufficient to store missings, why not do it that way? That way we have a consistent approach.
But in the case of alternating, between two background colors, you have cyclic. There's no reason to expand out that cyclic to information to 1,000,000 rows.
I got it. But I mean, that's like saying background. I mean, it could be that we decide the scaffolding stuff is at the beginning, at least, supported only in background arrow cyclic blah blah blah. That we do have a little bit of this type of syntax, right, of this stuff here, that we allow that for the scaffolding stuff, and then we use annotation tabulars for the data, writing with the data type stuff.
Right, which I think is what I was saying earlier, that I view the annotate stuff as being much more likely to be right with the data than scaffolding.
Fine. Okay. So then, all right. So then the preliminary conclusion is we have a set of functions like background arrow, and we use background arrow and we use it just like grid, but we try and clean the syntax up a bit, which we will backflow into grid and so on.
Can we use associations?
Yes.
Could like, a row key and a column key, lowercase k's on the keys, right? So row background goes to association, row goes to some cyclic spec or something, or rows.
Possibly yes. Possibly yes. I mean, that seems reasonable to me to design something like that. And then in the case of the annotate, we're not doing, I mean, things like cyclic don't make any sense. We're just referencing at the time of the annotation, we're saying add this metadata to what's ultimately this this item in the tabular. Make sense?
Yeah, I think I like this, and then it sort of makes it clear where you're taking the time hit.
Yes.
Um.
All right. Why don't you guys? I think it's time for my next. Not. Yeah, I'm supposed to go to something now.
No, I think we're at a good spot. So.
Also, I mean, I think we need to think about sort of workflows. So, by far the most used function later on for graphs is highlight graph.
Yes.
At construction time, I think it's the options and stuff. If you build a function, it's the options. But later on in workflows, I think it's highlight graph.
Well, maybe we want highlight tabular.
I think so, but I wanted to have the base things in first.
Right. I mean, highlight tabular, if we get annotate.
Because we can do, so an example of something we can do in addition in such a thing is like, you don't necessarily even need to specify how to highlight. So I'm saying that's like highlight graph, you often don't specify how. You just say what.
I got it.
And we do a pretty good job. And we can do fancy things, like a good way to highlight something is to de-highlight the rest. For instance.
Fine. But fine. So then the syntax of annotate with its location specification could get used in Highlight Tabular.
Yes. Yes, but it's another function that sort of adds value and higher level kind of usage.
Oh, we have an Highlight Tabular already.
We do.
It's in the prototype builds, but because
yeah,
it
also, I mean,
overlaps.
I thought we needed it, but we wanted this base thing that it
I
compiles
think
to.
we've got a design direction here. So why don't you guys try and develop it a bit? Let's meet in a few days and try and take it further.
Okay,
Makes sense? Okay.
sounds good.
All right. See you guys soon. Thanks
See
a
ya.
lot.
Bye.